Hey everybody, today we are diving into the book of Lamentations, which is a really small book that fits in between Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Now, this is a book that is written by an unnamed author. However, most people think that it's likely the prophet Jeremiah, who is looking back over the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile that happens to Babylon, and basically cries out 5 different psalms of lament. Lament is a big word that simply means to cry out. If you read through, this is exactly what you will find happening. And these laments, these 5 different laments, are poems, and they're really interesting because in the original Hebrew language, they are what's called acrostic poems. That is, they start from the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet and they work all the way through the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. In other words, it's like the writer, the author, is crying out to God, lamenting the destruction that has happened, the suffering that they endured, the sadness that they feel, and they're listing it off from A to Z for you Aussie speakers, but using the Hebrew alphabet. And lament is a really interesting category in our Bibles. And you see it through the book of Job. You see it in various Psalms. You even see Jesus doing it when he cries out in the Garden of Gethsemane, "My God," "Father, take this cup from me." Lament is this form of crying out to God, of deep human sorrow and suffering, asking the question, God, where are you? How can you let this happen? Don't you see the pain that I'm going through? Where are you? And the interesting thing about lament is that it's deeply biblical. So through the book of Lamentations and the other places that I mentioned, lament are very human words directed to God. Wondering, asking, questioning, even doubting in some instances God's goodness and God's presence. And yet, these laments get recorded and preserved, and they, in turn, become God's words back to us, which I think is a really incredible thing. That when we find ourselves, like the author does here, in the depths of despair and suffering, that it is okay and it is biblical to cry out to God, to wonder where he is, to ask God to show up, and to even have doubt. It's okay to wrestle through those deep emotions when you are faced with tremendous suffering and sadness. But that is not the end of the story. And these get preserved in here because the compilers of the Bible recognize that there's something about us crying out that is actually deeply human and embedded into who we are, but it's also allowing us to understand how God speaks to us back through our pain and suffering. So as you read through these, you're meant to sort of put yourself in the place of someone who's gone through the deepest suffering and sorrow and wrestle through the things that they're wrestling through, asking the questions that they're asking, and crying about the destruction that they faced and the torment that they're going through. But that's not the end. And even in the worst laments, we are meant to know that that's not the end of the story. Though it's okay to cry out and question, we know that these are God's words back to us, which means there is hope. And so how do we know this? Well, in the very center of the book of Lamentations comes this verse. It's one of the only verses of hope in the whole book, but it's really powerful. It says this in Lamentations chapter 3, starting in verse 19. He says, I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I will remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. He's saying, look, I'm suffering, and I'm bitter. Affliction is following me wherever I go. That's kind of what a lament is. However, it continues. Yet this I will call to mind, and therefore have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. For his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear this yoke while he is young. And so there's this cry in the middle of the suffering and despair and the shaking your fist and doubting God. There's this cry of hope that even though these things are going on, we know God has a better word. God is still there. His compassions are new every morning. Great is his faithfulness. So we will not be consumed. And so I think the lesson for us is that it's okay to have moments of doubt, despair, to cry out, to question. That's okay because it is biblical. It's preserved in the Bible here for us, examples of what it looks like. But the point is that through our pain and suffering, we go to God with them rather than away from God. Rather than saying, because of my pain and suffering, I quit. I want nothing to do with you, Lord. These people, these laments, including the whole book of Lamentations, are directed at God. God, I'm bringing my pain and suffering to you. Where are you? Do something about it. And because of that clinging to God in our pain, there is hope. And we know that pain and suffering is not the end of the story. That's all I got to say. We'll see you next week for the book of Ezekiel. Bye.